School. Athletics. Athlete. Likeness. Athletics.
Sports, likeness, athletes, likeness, likeness, athletes, sports, likeness, school, sports,
school, athletes, likeness, athletes,
Athletics. School.
Sports, likeness, athletes, sports, athletics, law, athletics, sports, likeness, athletes, sports, such athletes, sports, athletics, sports.
Likeness, sports, athletics, sports,
athletes, school sports officials, the top athletes, likeness, schools, ultimate. Our ability is in athletes, athletics, likeness, sports,
sports,
Athlete. School.
likeness,
School. Athletics. School. Athletes. School.
likeness, athletes,
School.
sports, athletes, school, athletes, school, athletes, athletes,
likeness, athletes, school,
Likeness, athletes, sports, school, athletes.
athletes, boulders, that they have athletes, sports, athletes,
School.
Athletes, likeness, athletics,
likeness, athletes, school,
athletes, sports, athletes.
plunging issue,
But so if athletes, sports.
Athletics,
Athletics.
athletics, sports, likeness,
sports, athletes, sports, academics,
athletes, school,
sports,
very
athletes, sports, athletes, sports,
School. Sports.
likeness, athletes,
sports,
Athletics.
Sports, athletes,